Have you noticed how exhausting it is to keep the world in your grip? You map out your days, your relationships, your future, like a carefully written script, hoping reality will play along. You rehearse conversations in your mind, manage the timing of events, adjust your behavior like a stage actor, all to maintain a certain image or to ensure the story unfolds exactly as you envisioned. And yet life keeps slipping sideways. Outcomes resist your plans. People don't follow the roles you've assigned, and circumstances refuse to bend. Each attempt to tighten your hold only seems to magnify the chaos. The harder you push, the further it drifts. There comes a moment when the strain is no longer bearable. You feel it in your body first, a heaviness in the chest, a tightness in the shoulders, a restlessness in the mind, and underneath it all a quiet truth whispers you are not in control and you never truly were. That whisper can feel like a threat to the ego because control is its fortress. Without it, what keeps the unknown from swallowing you whole? But somewhere deeper beyond the voice of fear, another knowing stirs, that perhaps the freedom you have been chasing does not live in mastery over life, but in surrender to it. Carl Jung saw this paradox again and again. The ego clings to control as if it were a lifeline. Yet it is the very grip that keeps you from touching the deeper currents that could carry you where you need to go. He once said, "A life not fully lived is a disease," and he meant that when you confine yourself within the walls of fear and control, you suffocate your own vitality. You mistake safety for wholeness, certainty for truth, and in doing so, you trade your aliveness for an illusion. Think of the energy you spend trying to manage outcomes. The endless mental rehearsals, the guarded words, the cautious steps, the suppression of feelings that might disturb the image you've crafted. This constant vigilance is not harmless. It drains you. It keeps you in a perpetual state of contraction, unable to breathe fully into the present moment. Jung understood the law of opposites and antiodromia, that the more extreme the force, the more certain its reversal. The more fiercely you cling to a thing, the more likely it is to dissolve through your fingers. The more you try to control others, the more they resist. The more you fight the shadows in yourself, the more powerfully they move in the dark, unseen, but directing your life. It is only when you loosen your grip, not in resignation, but in conscious choice, that a new kind of intelligence begins to move. Jung called it synchronicity, the meeting of inner state and outer event in meaningful coincidence. It is as if the world begins to mirror the subtle changes inside you, arranging itself around your openness instead of your commands. But this can only happen when you stop shouting at life and start listening. Surrender is not passivity. It is the courage to let the false security of control fall away, so that you can stand in the truth of uncertainty without turning away. It is the willingness to meet life as it comes without insisting that it conform to your design. And yet surrender asks for something even more difficult than releasing the world. It asks that you release the hold you have on yourself. Why do you cling so tightly to the reins Jung traced it to? Fear, not the fleeting fear of danger in the moment, but the deep inherited fears etched into the unconscious. Fear of being seen, fear of failing, fear of pain, fear of not being enough. These fears are not random. They are the residue of old wounds formed in moments when your vulnerability met rejection or harm. And so the ego built walls and called them control, not realizing that the fortress became the prison. Beneath those fears live the shadow parts of you, the traits, desires, and emotions you have been taught to suppress because they did not fit the persona you were rewarded for presenting to the world. The persona is the mask you wear to belong, to be acceptable, to be safe. But everything the mask cannot hold. The anger, the envy, the grief, the longing gets pushed into the shadow. And yet what you banish does not vanish. It waits. It shapes your reactions, your choices, your relationships from beneath the surface. Jung taught that the work is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it, to turn toward the parts of yourself you have feared and denied, and to bring them into dialogue. Imagine sitting across from your own fear, your own jealousy, your own grief, and asking, "What do you need from me? What are you trying to protect?" You may discover that these parts are not your enemies, but guardians who have been using outdated strategies to keep you safe. When you listen, you begin to reclaim the energy bound up in resistance, and that energy becomes available for creativity, for connection, for living. As you integrate, the need for control naturally loosens. You no longer have to keep a constant lid on your emotions because they no longer feel like threats. You no longer have to script every interaction because you are no longer afraid of who you might be without the script. You begin to realize that the self you have been defending so fiercely was never your full self, only a fragment, only the mask. And here is where the miracle begins to unfold. In releasing control, you do not fall into chaos, you fall into a larger order, one you do not have to manage for it to hold you. Life begins to meet you in ways you could not have designed. The right words arrive in the moment you need them. The right person calls without knowing why. The path appears where before there was only a wall. But to step into this way of living, you must be willing to die to the old way, the way of constant management, of mistrust, of bracing against life. This is not an easy death. The ego will fight to keep its throne, convincing you that without control you will lose yourself. But the truth is the opposite. Without control, you will find yourself not the self that needs approval or predictability, but the one that is whole, whether the world bends or breaks. That, self Jung said, is the organizing center of the psyche, far wiser than the conscious mind. The ego sees in fragments. The self perceives the whole. And when you stop identifying solely with the ego's narrow view, you begin to act from a deeper intelligence, one that does not need to control, because it already belongs to the larger pattern. It starts with one breath, one unclenched hand, one moment where you notice the impulse to tighten and instead choose to soften. And in that moment, life rushes in. You begin to see that this softening is not weakness. It is the quiet strength of aligning yourself with something vast and alive. Control is a rigid posture. Surrender is a living stance. In surrender, you are not collapsing. You are widening. You are allowing the deeper currents of your being to rise, to take their rightful place in guiding you. Jung observed that the moment you stop resisting the contents of your own unconscious, they start to transform. It is as though what you have been pushing away finally breathes, and in that breath it changes shape. The monster in the dark corner becomes a wounded child. The rage you feared would consume you reveals itself as the voice of a part of you that has been silenced too long. Even your deepest shame can become a doorway to compassion when it is met with understanding instead of exile. This is why control is so seductive, because it spares you, at least temporarily, from facing these encounters. The ego says, if I can keep everything in place, I will never have to feel what I have buried. But the cost of that bargain is enormous. You trade the raw, unpredictable aliveness of your inner life for a narrow hallway of safe, familiar reactions. You keep your shadow at bay, but you also keep your own wholeness out of reach. When you allow these disowned parts to come into view, you are practicing what Jung called individuation, the gradual process of becoming whole. Individuation is not about becoming perfect or achieving some final state of serenity. It is about weaving together the fragments of your psyche into a living unity so that you no longer have to pretend to be one-dimensional. It is about recognizing that your light and your darkness are not enemies but partners in your unfolding. In this way, surrender becomes an act of radical honesty. You stop trying to be only what the world finds acceptable. You let yourself be complex, contradictory, unfinished. You make room for the unknown, not just in the world around you, but inside yourself. And as you do, the compulsion to manage every outcome begins to dissolve because you are no longer terrified of what might surface. You might notice that as you loosen your grip internally, your relationships begin to shift as well. When you stop controlling your own image, you stop needing to control others to protect it. You allow people to surprise you, to reveal who they are instead of who you think they should be. And in that space, intimacy grows. It is the intimacy that comes from meeting in truth, not performance. Jung compared the meeting of two souls to the interaction of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Control tries to prevent the reaction. It tries to keep the chemistry predictable. But when you let go, the alchemy begins. You change each other not through manipulation, but through authentic encounter. The same is true with life itself. How many times have you fought against a change only to discover later that it was the doorway to something greater? How many times have you been certain that something was a disaster, only to realize it carried you to an unforeseen opportunity? This is the pattern Jung saw over and over, that the things we resist most fiercely often contain the very medicine we need. Surrendering to that truth does not mean abandoning your dreams or neglecting your responsibilities. It means recognizing that the path toward what you long for may not match the route you had in mind. It means understanding that there is wisdom in the unexpected, that sometimes the detour is the real road. Control imagines safety as the elimination of risk. But real safety comes from trust. Not blind trust in some external force, but trust in your own ability to meet what arises. You begin to understand that you can walk into the unknown and still remain yourself. You can face loss and not be erased by it. You can be hurt and still stay open to love. When you stop trying to manipulate every moment, you begin to act from a different source. Jung called this source the self, not the small I of daily roles, but the deeper organizing principle of your being. The self does not need to dominate because it is already connected to the whole. The ego pushes and pulls. The self moves with precision as if guided by an invisible thread. And this is perhaps the greatest paradox of letting go. When you stop forcing life to follow your commands, your actions become more effective, not less. You are no longer acting out of fear, scrambling to prevent imagined disasters. You are moving in harmony with a larger pattern, responding to what is actually present. Decisions arise with a clarity that does not require overthinking because they are rooted in the deeper soil of your own truth. This is not a one-time shift. It is a practice. There will be days when the old reflex to control snaps back when fear surges and you find yourself trying to tighten the frame again. But each time you notice and soften, each time you pause instead of grasp, you reinforce a new way of being. You begin to see that life is not asking you to dominate it, but to meet it fully openly without pretense. And in meeting life this way, you discover something you could never have managed into existence: the quiet miracle of belonging to yourself without conditions. There is a moment, and perhaps you've already felt it, when the burden of control begins to slip from your shoulders, and in its place there is a strange and unfamiliar lightness. It doesn't come with fireworks or grand revelations. It arrives quietly, like the sound of a door you didn't know was locked suddenly clicking open. You breathe, and for the first time in a long while, the breath feels complete. In that lightness, you start to notice the world differently. The edges of things seem softer. The air feels less like a force you must push against, and more like something that moves with you. Conversations that once felt like strategic negotiations become genuine exchanges. You begin to listen not just to others, but to the subtle movement inside yourself. Impulses, intuitions, the faint stirring of desires you had long silenced. This is where Jung's idea of synchronicity becomes more than a concept. You begin to see it at work, the curious way events line up, the unexpected meeting that carries a message you needed to hear. The book that falls into your lap just when the question it answers has been circling your mind. These are not accidents. They are reflections, outer expressions of the inner alignment you are beginning to cultivate. The controlling ego hates coincidence because it cannot take credit for it. But when you shift your allegiance from control to connection, you see that life has always been speaking to you. You were simply too busy managing its script to hear. And as you listen more closely, you realize that much of what you feared about letting go was never about the outer world. It was about what you might discover inside yourself if the noise quieted. Because when you are no longer consumed with controlling others or managing every contingency, the unconscious has room to speak. Dreams become more vivid. Symbols and images rise unbidden, carrying messages from depths your waking mind cannot reach. Jung saw dreams as the natural language of the unconscious, a direct line to the parts of you that hold wisdom the ego does not possess. By paying attention, by recording them, sitting with them, asking them what they want to show you, you begin to deepen your relationship with the self. In this relationship, you encounter figures that Jung would call archetypes, patterns of human experience that live within all of us. The nurturing mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the inner child. Each arrives with its own gifts and shadows. And here another truth emerges. Surrender is not a straight line into serenity. The unconscious will not simply hand you peace, it will hand you what you need to grow. Sometimes that means meeting the very thing you've spent your life avoiding. But now, without the iron grip of control, you have the space to meet it differently. You no longer have to banish it. You can engage with it as Jung encouraged through active imagination, a conscious dialogue between the waking mind and the figures or feelings that arise from within. You sit with your fear as if it were a person in the room. You ask your anger what it is protecting. You let your sadness speak without interruption. Through this dialogue, the shadow becomes less a threat and more a collaborator in your wholeness. What you once pushed away begins to return, bringing back the vitality it carried. You discover that each shadow holds a key, not to the life you imagined when you were managing every detail, but to the life that fits you in ways you could never have planned. This is where the deeper shift begins. You stop seeing surrender as loss and start seeing it as integration. You are not giving up control because you are weak. You are releasing control because you no longer need to split yourself apart to survive. And with this, something profound begins to happen in the outer world. Relationships you thought were stagnant start to breathe. Opportunities you never considered become visible. Conflicts that seemed unresolvable soften sometimes without a single direct intervention from you. This is not magic in the sense of bending reality to your will. It is magic in the sense of discovering that when you are whole, reality meets you in kind. The old habit of control will still whisper to you, especially in moments of uncertainty or pain. It will promise safety if you just tighten your grip. But now you know the truth. Safety that comes from contraction is not safety at all. It is a postponement of life. And so in those moments, you choose differently. You pause. You breathe. You listen inward before you act outward. Sometimes that listening will lead you to take bold action. Sometimes it will lead you to wait. The difference is that your movement now comes from a place of inner coherence, not fear. This is the paradox Jung understood so well. When you surrender, you do not disappear. You arrive. You step into your life fully, not as the manager of a fragile script, but as the living author of a story that is unfolding in collaboration with something far greater than your plans. There is a certain rawness that comes with this way of living. Without the armor of control, you feel more the sting of disappointment, the sharp edge of uncertainty, the vulnerability of showing yourself without guarantees. But you also feel more of the beauty, the subtle graces that were invisible when your gaze was fixed on managing outcomes. The warmth in a stranger's smile, the sudden clarity of a sunrise after days of gray, the quiet sense that you are exactly where you need to be even if you do not know why. Jung saw this as the awakening of the inner compass, the self guiding you not through rigid rules, but through resonance. When something is right for you, it carries a certain quality of energy, an inner yes that does not need justification. And when something is wrong, even if it looks perfect on the outside, you feel the dissonance immediately. This kind of knowing does not thrive in a life run by control. It requires the open space that surrender provides. As you keep walking this path, the relationship between your inner and outer worlds begins to change. You see that projection, the unconscious habit of attributing your own disowned qualities to others, has shaped much of your experience. When you feared your own anger, you saw hostility in everyone else. When you rejected your own need for rest, you labeled others as lazy. Projection is the shadow's way of entering your life through the back door, and control is often the method you use to keep those projected qualities at bay. But now, with a growing willingness to meet your shadow directly, you start reclaiming those projections. You see that what you judged in others was often what you could not accept in yourself. And as you integrate those parts, the outer world becomes less of a battlefield. People stop triggering you in the same way because you are no longer at war with the reflection they offer. This shift in perception is one of the quiet miracles of individuation. You realize that so much of what you were trying to control in others was actually an attempt to manage your own unacknowledged feelings. The release of control, then, is not a gamble. It is the natural outcome of taking responsibility for your own inner life. And with that responsibility comes freedom. You can allow others to be as they are without needing them to conform to your comfort zone. You can let relationships evolve or even end without clinging to them as proof of your worth. This is not detachment in the cold sense of indifference, but a deeper intimacy born of respect for your path and for theirs. Jung compared the psyche to a living organism, one that seeks wholeness the way a plant seeks light. The ego's attempt to control is like trying to force a plant to grow in the shape you imagine, bending its stem, pruning its leaves to match an ideal. You might create something orderly, but you might also damage its vitality. When you instead focus on the conditions, the soil, the light, the water, and allow the plant's own intelligence to direct its growth, you create the space for it to flourish. The same is true for your life. You cannot control the exact form it will take, but you can tend to the conditions: honest self-reflection, compassionate acceptance of your shadow, openness to the messages of your dreams, the courage to act from your deepest truth. These are not external manipulations. They are internal alignments. And from them, life grows in ways you could never have scripted. This growth is rarely linear. You will have days of clarity followed by days when the fog returns, when the urge to grasp at control rises again. The difference now is that you can see the pattern. You can feel the contraction when it happens, and you can choose not to mistake it for strength. You can soften again, trusting that even in the fog, the self is still guiding you. Over time, this trust deepens into something like reverence, not for some distant deity, but for the intricate, mysterious intelligence that moves through you and the world. You realize that the same force that turns seeds into forests, tides into oceans, seasons into cycles, is also shaping the unfolding of your life. And in that realization, control becomes unnecessary, not because nothing matters, but because everything is held in a larger order than you can orchestrate. From this place, you begin to live less as a strategist and more as a participant. You still make plans, you still act with intention, but you are no longer bound by the fear that if you do not hold the reins tightly enough, everything will collapse. You understand now that some of the most important turns in your life came not from your control, but from its absence. This is the quiet revolution. Jung invites you into a way of living that is not about defeating the unknown, but befriending it. A way of meeting each moment without the weight of needing to dominate it. A way of allowing yourself to be shaped by what you encounter, trusting that the shaping is part of your becoming. At first, this trust feels fragile, like a new sprout you're afraid to touch in case it breaks. You find yourself testing it, watching to see if life will really hold you without the constant intervention of control. And life, in its own unpredictable way, responds not always by giving you what you want, but by giving you what reveals your strength. You begin to understand that surrender is not about being spared from difficulty, it is about discovering who you are inside it. Jung once said, "I am not what has happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That choice, when freed from the compulsions of control, becomes vast. You are no longer limited to the narrow identity you have been defending. You can explore, experiment, fail, begin again, all without the crushing need for each outcome to prove your worth. The self that emerges in this space is not the brittle persona you once showed the world, but the living, breathing wholeness of your being. With this wholeness comes a new relationship to time. Control lives in the future in constant negotiation with what might happen. It anxiously pulls you out of the present to prepare for a moment that may never come. But surrender draws you back here into the immediacy of what is. You begin to inhabit your moments more fully, not as waiting rooms for some future event, but as complete experiences in themselves. Even the mundane begins to carry a certain radiance. The texture of sunlight on a table, the rhythm of your breath, the way silence can feel alive when you stop trying to fill it. And when the future does arrive, it often looks different from what you imagined. But you notice that you are different too. More flexible, more open, more able to adapt without losing your center. This adaptability is not born of indifference, but of connection. You are rooted now in something deeper than circumstances, something that does not rise and fall with every shift in the wind. This rootedness changes the way you face loss. Where once you might have clung desperately to keep something from leaving you, now understand that endings are not always failures. Sometimes they are the necessary clearing that makes space for what is next. You grieve, yes, but you no longer make grief an enemy to be defeated by control. You allow it to move through you, trusting that it too is part of your becoming. And in the same way you meet joy without trying to possess it. You do not cage it with expectations or freeze it in place through fear of its passing. You let it breathe. You let it go when it goes, knowing it will return in its own season. This is the rhythm of a life lived in dialogue with itself rather than in dictatorship. The more you live this way, the more you notice the subtle choreography between your inner shifts and the events of your outer life. You find yourself in conversations that mirror the very insight you were wrestling with. You cross paths with someone whose story illuminates a question you had not spoken aloud. These synchronicities no longer feel like rare miracles, but like the natural language of a connected existence. And you realize something else, that by releasing control, you are not just changing your own life. You are changing the field you share with others. Your openness invites openness. Your willingness to be real creates a space where others can put down their own masks. This is how transformation ripples outward, not through force, but through presence. It is here that community takes on a new meaning. You see that individuation, the journey toward becoming your true self, is deeply personal, but it is not solitary. We awaken in one another's reflections. We grow in the friction and the grace of relationship. When you share your own moments of surrender, your own encounters with the shadow, you become part of a collective alchemy. Your story may be the mirror in which someone else first recognizes themselves. And perhaps that is one of the quietest but most profound miracles of letting go. The realization that your authenticity is not just a gift to yourself, but to everyone you meet. You no longer have to control how they receive it. You trust that the truth of who you are will find its way to where it needs to go. This is not the end of the work, but it is a turning point. The compulsion to control will visit you again as old patterns do. But now, you have touched a different way of being. You have felt the current that moves beneath your strategies, and you know you can return to it. This knowledge is a kind of homecoming, not to a place, but to yourself. And so you find yourself walking through life differently, not with the tight, forward-leaning posture of someone bracing against what's ahead, but with a grounded presence that meets each step as it lands. You are still moving toward your dreams, still shaping your life with intention, but you are no longer fighting reality to make it match the image in your mind. There is a subtle but profound shift from insisting to listening, from demanding to collaborating. In this listening, you begin to sense layers of yourself you had never truly inhabited. There is the surface self, the one who speaks, acts, and navigates the world. But there are also the quieter voices within the anima, or animus, the inner counterpart to your conscious identity, carrying the qualities you have not yet integrated. Jung described this figure as the bridge between the ego and the deeper self, often appearing in dreams or fantasies as a person who captivates you, provokes you, or unsettles you in ways you cannot explain. When you meet this inner figure, whether in a dream's embrace or in the way someone in waking life stirs something unnameable in you, you are encountering a mirror of your own unclaimed wholeness. In the past, the impulse might have been to control that feeling, to contain it, to make it safe. But now you are learning to be curious, to ask, what part of me is being called into awareness right now? What am I being asked to see? This curiosity changes the way you relate not just to yourself, but to everything. You begin to sense that every encounter, every challenge, every joy and loss is part of a larger dialogue between your conscious life and the vast unfolding intelligence of the unconscious. The ego wants to turn this into a puzzle to be solved, but the self invites you to experience it as a mystery to be lived. And in living it, you discover an entirely different kind of power. Not the brittle power of control, but the steady power of alignment. The more you listen inward, the more your actions outward carry a certain inevitability, as though they were the natural next step rather than the result of endless calculation. This is the kind of action that feels like truth in motion. It requires effort, but the effort is not strained. Of course, life will still bring storms. There will still be moments when the ground drops out beneath you, when the map you thought you were following disintegrates. But even here, you will notice a difference. You will feel the fear, the grief, the anger, but you will also feel the ground of your own being beneath it all. You are no longer just the one weathering the storm. You are also the space in which the storm is happening. And storms pass. They always do. Jung knew that the process of individuation, of becoming who you truly are, was not a straight ascent into light. It is a spiral moving again and again between descent and return. You descend into the shadow, into the unlit places, not to be swallowed by them, but to retrieve what they have been guarding. Each return brings you back into the world more whole, more real, more capable of meeting life without needing to bend it to your will. And something remarkable happens as this spiral continues. You stop asking, "How do I control my life?" and start asking, "How do I participate fully in it?" The shift seems small, but it changes everything. Control is about narrowing possibilities to fit your plans. Participation is about opening yourself to possibilities you could not have conceived. It is here that you begin to see the deeper meaning of Jung's words. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This becoming is not a performance for the world, nor is it a fixed destination. It is a continual unfolding, a willingness to meet each new facet of yourself with the same openness you bring to the turning seasons. And so you live in dialogue with your dreams, with your relationships, with the moments of synchronicity that remind you you are woven into something vast. You still shape your life, but you do so the way a gardener shapes a garden, by tending to what is here, by nurturing the conditions for growth, and then stepping back to let life's own intelligence take over. You may not know exactly what will bloom next, but you trust that when it does, you will be ready to meet it. There exists among us a rare kind of woman whose brilliance cannot be charted on academic graphs or captured by IQ tests. Her intelligence is not the kind you can measure, but the kind you can feel, a subterranean wisdom moving like hidden rivers beneath the earth of human consciousness. When you encounter her, you know, though you may not be able to say why. Something in your chest shifts, a quiet gravity pulls at you as if she carries within her the forgotten language of the soul. Even her silences speak, and they speak louder than words, reminding you that truth is not always carried in sound, but often in presence. Depth psychologists have long been fascinated by this type of woman. Carl Jung himself recognized that certain women possess a capacity he called the superior feeling function, a way of perceiving reality that transcends sentimentality and ordinary sensitivity. These women do not merely feel, they perceive with the invisible instruments of the psyche. They sense vibrations that move beneath spoken words. They read symbols where others see only coincidence. They walk through life as though they are both within and beyond it, navigating currents most people are unaware even exist. What I will unfold for you are 6 invisible traits that mark these spiritually intelligent women. Traits that separate them from those who perform spirituality or confuse reactivity with wisdom. These qualities live in the shadows of consciousness, rarely recognized, often misunderstood, but always unmistakable to those who encounter them. And like all true gifts, they carry a double edge. For the woman who embodies them, life is both blessing and burden, sanctuary and exile. The first trait reveals itself not in words, but in energy. These women step into a room and the air thickens, not with tension but with presence. A subtle shift that others cannot explain, though they feel it instinctively. Something unspoken vibrates through the atmosphere, a silent reminder that truth is always present even when ignored. Jung described this as the higher expression of the feeling function, not an indulgence in emotions but an attunement to authenticity, to the subtle signatures of joy, sorrow, deception, and sincerity that ripple invisibly through human interaction. She becomes a living barometer of the soul. At a dinner table, she knows the resentment a couple hides beneath their smiles. She feels the grief beneath a neighbor's cheerfulness. She senses the hunger behind a friend's charm. What others would dismiss as imagination, she knows as pattern recognition. Her nervous system trained often unconsciously to register what others cannot bear to see. This sensitivity is not learned overnight. It is often the inheritance of generations of women who developed such radar out of necessity. Grandmothers who had to hear the storm in a man's footstep before the violence erupted. Mothers who could read danger in a neighbor's glance or opportunity in a silence too long. Their vigilance became survival, and survival became wisdom flowing through bloodlines like an underground stream that resurfaces in daughters who cannot explain why crowded rooms exhaust them, why strangers' smiles unsettle them, why their intuition so often proves correct. But to see with such clarity is not without cost. To feel truth so vividly is to notice masks everywhere. Performance, pretense, manipulation, it all reveals itself. And when you hold up a mirror, not everyone wants to see their reflection. These women often find themselves isolated, not because they desire separation, but because their presence unmasks illusions others cling to for survival. She becomes the oracle who speaks truths mistaken for judgment, the mirror that reveals what others would rather keep hidden. And so paradoxically, her gift isolates her. She walks between belonging and exile, needed yet resisted. Think of those moments when you stepped into a space and knew without evidence that something was off, or the sudden aversion you felt to someone whose intentions were later revealed to be harmful. That is a fragment of what these women live with daily, a literacy in energy, a fluency in the unspoken language of the unconscious. It is not paranoia, but perception. It is not fantasy, but the psyche's deeper recognition of what the eyes cannot see. This first trait, energetic literacy, marks them as guardians of emotional truth. They do not choose this guardianship, it chooses them. And yet through this gift, they hold a sacred responsibility to discern, to reflect, and at times to carry burdens others refuse to acknowledge. The second trait emerges not only in their perception of the personal, but in their relationship with what Jung called the collective unconscious. This is the deep reservoir of archetypes and symbols shared across all humanity, the mythic patterns that shape our dreams, our religions, our art, our fears. Most people catch glimpses of this vast ocean, an occasional dream that feels prophetic, a coincidence too striking to ignore. But for these women, the veil between the personal psyche and the collective sea is thinner. They live with the waters washing constantly against their shores. They dream in images that later appear in waking life. They encounter symbols that guide their choices. They notice synchronicities with such frequency that they begin to trust them as signposts placed by an intelligence greater than their own. While others dismiss such moments as chance, these women know them as dialogue, as whispers from the deeper mind of humanity communicating in a symbolic tongue that predates language itself. Jung noted that some people have a more permeable ego boundary, a self porous enough to receive the collective without being drowned by it. These women embody that porousness. They serve as translators between the mythic and the mundane. A dream of water might tell them of emotional healing ahead. A sudden encounter with a hawk may remind them of vision and power. Numbers repeating on a clock become confirmations of path and timing. Their lives weave themselves like myth, guided by signs others cannot read. But again, this too is double-edged. To live so close to the archetypal realm is to live in constant dialogue with forces larger than the self. It can be disorienting, overwhelming, even alienating. Their task is not simply to receive, but to ground these messages into human language, into practical wisdom. They must bring down lightning without being struck, carry fire without being consumed. For them, life becomes a kind of mythic narrative. They stumble into situations at just the right time, offer words that become lifelines to strangers, or embody symbols that awaken others without even trying. They are bridges between realms, not by choice, but by nature. And because of this, their existence often carries the uncanny texture of destiny, as though their lives are being co-written by invisible hands. This connection to the collective unconscious places them at a threshold, a liminal space where they are neither entirely within the ordinary nor fully consumed by the extraordinary. They are interpreters of symbols, dreamers whose visions bleed into reality, women whose lives become living myths. And in their presence, Others often feel as though they too are closer to something sacred, as though the ordinary moment has been brushed by eternity. The third trait, and perhaps the most paradoxical in a culture obsessed with constant connection, is their relationship with solitude. These women do not withdraw out of bitterness, nor out of a disdain for others, but from a sacred recognition that silence is fertile ground. Jung understood this deeply. Individuation, the process of becoming one's true self, requires stepping away from the noise of the collective. It requires creating a vessel, an inner sanctum, where the whispers of the unconscious can rise without distortion. Spiritually intelligent women instinctively honor this. They retreat not to escape life, but to enter it more fully. Their solitude is not exile, but incubation. It is the soil where seeds of transformation germinate away from the trampling feet of expectation. While the world confuses solitude with loneliness, they know the difference. One depletes, the other nourishes. To be alone with oneself is to descend into the alchemical laboratory of the soul. Imagine her sitting at a desk with a journal, or in silence with closed eyes, or walking through a forest with only the wind for company. These are not idle hours, but sacred labor. In these moments, the sediment of daily life settles and the clear waters of inner truth emerge. Insights arrive not as arguments, but as revelations. Pain rearranges itself into meaning. Chaos reveals its hidden order. Here the psyche whispers its secrets, and she listens. Yet such withdrawal is easily misunderstood. To family, her silence may appear as rejection. To friends, her absence may seem like depression. In a society that equates visibility with value, her disappearance is often judged. But she knows what others forget, that to offer authentic presence, she must first preserve her essence. Solitude for her is not an indulgence, but a discipline. Without it, she risks being drowned by the projections and demands of others. With it, she becomes a vessel clear enough to hold truth. And so, she learns to cycle between withdrawal and return. To enter the silence and then to emerge with gifts, clarity, compassion, creativity that the world desperately needs. Her solitude becomes her wellspring. Without it, she dries up. With it, she becomes a fountain. From this solitude arises the fourth trait, their capacity to transform suffering into wisdom. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing forces, light and shadow, until a new form of consciousness emerges. These women do not merely endure suffering, they descend into it with the courage of one who knows that pain is a doorway, not an ending. They are not spared hardship. In fact, they are often marked by trauma loss, betrayal, illness, the kinds of experiences that would leave others shattered. But instead of remaining victims, they descend like Inanna into the underworld, stripped of illusions, forced to face their own darkness. And when they return, they carry treasures that can only be mined in those depths. This is the ancient archetype of the wounded healer, the one who learns compassion not through theories but through scars. Their suffering becomes a kind of certification, a sacred initiation. Because they have walked through fire, they can walk with others who are burning. Because they have sat with despair, they can sit with others in theirs without flinching. Their wisdom is not second-hand. It is etched into their being. This process is not romantic. It is not the glorification of pain. It is brutal, terrifying, often lonely. But within it lies the possibility of transformation, the alchemy by which lead becomes gold. They learn to embrace contradiction, strength woven with vulnerability, joy braided with grief, clarity emerging from confusion. And in doing so, they become whole. Not perfect, not unscarred, but whole. This is the essence of Jung's vision of individuation, not the eradication of shadow, but the integration of it. These women do not flee from their darkness, nor do they allow it to consume them. They weave it into themselves, and in the weaving they create something new, something that radiates a presence both fierce and tender, a wholeness that others feel even if they cannot name it. And from this alchemy emerges a sacred responsibility. Once you have transmuted suffering into wisdom, you cannot keep it for yourself. It becomes medicine not just for your own soul, but for others. Many of these women feel drawn into roles of service as counselors, teachers, healers, or artists. Their art, their words, their presence becomes infused with the weight of truth, carrying the resonance of someone who has seen the abyss and chosen life anyway. This transformation into a wounded healer marks them indelibly. Their scars, rather than disfiguring them, become luminous. They become reminders that survival is possible, that transformation is real. And those who encounter them sense it immediately, not through what they say, but through what they are. The fifth trait grows naturally from this, their mastery of silence, of presence, of communication without words. Jung once spoke of therapeutic presence, the kind of being that heals not through advice, but through its simple existence. Spiritually intelligent women embody this in a profound way. When they enter a room of suffering, they do not rush to fix. They do not plaster wounds with platitudes. They simply sit. And in their silence, something opens. The unspoken message is clear. You are not alone. You are not broken beyond repair. You are seen. Their silence is not emptiness, but fullness. Pregnant with compassion, it speaks volumes without sound. People often say they feel better just by being around them, even briefly. This is not magic, but resonance. Their nervous systems, tempered through suffering and solitude, radiate coherence. Others unconsciously entrained to that frequency, remembering their own capacity for peace. These women become tuning forks of the soul, bringing others into harmony without effort. When they do choose words, they speak with precision. They have learned that language is not cheap. Words can wound, words can heal. And so they choose carefully, like an artist choosing colors. Their speech is sparse but potent, woven with meaning that lingers long after the sound has faded. And beyond words, their entire being communicates. The way they hold their body, the way they breathe, the way they listen. All of it carries a message. Life is survivable. Transformation is possible. Truth is bearable. They have mastered the subtle art of communication that bypasses the intellect and speaks directly to the soul. The sixth trait, perhaps the most mysterious of all, is their magnetism for the sacred, their uncanny ability to draw synchronicity to themselves like moths to a flame. While many spend their lives chasing spiritual experiences, these women seem to attract them without effort. They live as if the invisible threads of the cosmos are constantly weaving events around them, encounters that feel fated symbols that appear at just the right moment, opportunities that align too perfectly to be coincidence. All of these cluster in their orbit. Carl Jung named this phenomenon synchronicity, and he noted that for certain individuals, the world itself behaves like a mirror of the psyche. Reality bends to reflect inner truths, arranging itself in patterns that the logical mind cannot explain, but the soul instantly recognizes. For spiritually intelligent women, synchronicity is not an occasional marvel, but a constant companion. Their consciousness acts like a beacon tuned to frequencies of meaning. They walk through life as if accompanied by an invisible guide, whispering through signs and symbols. This magnetism is not cultivated through manipulation or spiritual posturing. It arises from authenticity. Because they live aligned with their inner truth, their outer reality resonates in kind. Jung suggested that unconscious complexes, psychic clusters of meaning, often act independently of the ego. For most people, they cause projection and reactivity. But in women attuned to spiritual intelligence, these complexes become refined instruments, aligning them with experiences that serve growth and purpose. Their psyches function like antennae catching signals that others miss, orienting them toward encounters that carry mythic weight. Their lives read like sacred texts. A stranger delivers the precise words they needed to hear. A dream is confirmed by a sudden real-world event. A chance meeting becomes the key to their next chapter. To skeptics, this may look like selective memory, but to them it is unmistakable communication. They understand that the universe speaks symbolically, and they have learned to listen. Yet discernment is essential. Not every synchronicity is sacred. Not every coincidence carries wisdom. They must learn to filter carefully to distinguish between genuine guidance and ego's desire for significance. For spiritual intelligence without discernment risks becoming spiritual inflation The belief that everything is about oneself, that every event is a personal sign. These women, however, recognize that meaning is not possession, but participation. They are not the center of the story, but co-walkers in the collective dance. Even when they try to hide their presence catalyzes transformation in others. They enter a room quietly and conversations shift. People confess truths they did not plan to share. Hearts soften, illusions crack. This catalytic effect is not their doing, but their being. They embody a frequency that awakens whether they intend it or not. In Jungian terms, they act as carriers of archetypal energy, unconsciously activating the dormant archetypes in those around them. The healer awakens, healing. The seeker awakens, seeking the mother, awakens, care. Their influence ripples invisibly, shaping lives without fanfare. But with maturity, another paradox arises. The more spiritually intelligent they become, the less they appear extraordinary. What once felt mystical becomes natural. They no longer seek to dramatize their insights or perform their wisdom. They stop feeling special and begin to feel simply human, yet deeply, profoundly human. Jung called this the return to simplicity at a higher level. After traversing the labyrinth of shadows and revelations, they arrive at ordinariness, but a sacred ordinariness. This ordinariness is itself a revelation. They carry wisdom lightly, no longer weighed down by the need to prove it. They walk in the world without labels, without display. Their spirituality ceases to be an identity and becomes a way of being. They embody the Taoist truth: the sage does not flaunt her power. Her greatness lies in her subtlety, in her ability to live truth quietly, to embody depth without performance. Here the journey circles back to the beginning. The solitude that once felt like exile becomes sanctuary. The sensitivity that once felt like burden becomes compass. The wisdom that once made them feel alien becomes the very medicine the world craves. Their invisibility is their strength, because true influence rarely announces itself. It moves silently, changing hearts and lives in ways that no one can measure. And so the spiritually intelligent woman becomes a living prayer. She carries within her the archetype of the wise woman, the oracle, the healer, not as roles she plays, but as truths she embodies. She reminds us that intelligence is not only the capacity to analyze, but also the ability to perceive, to feel, to endure, to transform. She shows us that wisdom is not only knowledge, but presence, not only words, but silence, not only self, but service. If you recognize yourself here, you may already feel the paradox of your path, the burden of your sensitivity, the loneliness of your solitude, the weight of your insights. But you may also feel the quiet strength that comes from knowing you are part of something ancient. You walk a lineage. You carry within you the wisdom of ancestors who learned to survive through perception, the archetypes that guide humanity across time, the collective intelligence that whispers through your dreams and synchronicities. You are not accidental. You are necessary. To walk this path requires courage, the courage to trust what cannot be measured, the courage to honor your solitude when the world demands noise, the courage to hold pain until it turns to wisdom, the courage to remain authentic in a culture that rewards masks. But if you are called, you know there is no alternative. The intelligence within you is not optional. It is your inheritance. And so the journey continues with every choice, every breath, every act of presence. You may never receive applause. You may never be recognized for the transformations you catalyze, but you will know in the quiet chambers of your soul that you are fulfilling the assignment given to you by a deeper intelligence, one that orchestrates existence itself. There is something archetypal about the path of these women. It is not merely a personal story, but a reenactment of an ancient drama, one that stretches across cultures and centuries. Jung would remind us that the human psyche is not only individual, but collective. Within each of us live the archetypes, the universal images and patterns that shape myths, religions, and stories across the world. The spiritually intelligent woman carries within her, often unconsciously, the archetype of the wise woman, the priestess, the oracle, the healer. She is not playing a role. She is embodying a pattern that humanity has always known. When she listens to silence and draws wisdom from it, she echoes the sibyls of ancient Greece women whose visions shaped empires. When she transforms suffering into wisdom, she mirrors the archetype of the wounded healer present in myths from Chiron to Christ. When she serves as a catalyst in others' lives without intention, she channels the archetype of the trickster teacher whose very presence exposes illusions and births transformation. Her life is not only her own, it is myth incarnate. But here lies the paradox. Modern culture has little room for such archetypes. The wise woman is often dismissed as eccentric, the healer marginalized, the oracle silenced. In a world driven by metrics, efficiency, and external validation, the invisible gifts of the spiritually intelligent woman are often treated as irrelevant or threatening. She may be mocked for her sensitivity, pathologized for her solitude, accused of arrogance for her discernment. And yet she endures because her calling is not dependent on recognition. This is the essence of what Jung called individuation, to live authentically according to the self. The deeper organizing principle of the psyche rather than bending to the expectations of the collective. Individuation requires sacrifice. To individuate is to step away from the tribe to risk misunderstanding, to accept exile as the price of authenticity. These women embody that exile, but through it they become bridges connecting the collective unconscious with waking life. Sociologically, their role is crucial. Every culture needs its carriers of wisdom, those who stand at the margins and remind the center of its forgotten truths. Historically, these women may have been the midwives, the medicine women, the storytellers, the ones who listened to dreams and saw the signs in the stars. Today, their role persists, though, disguised the counselor who offers more than advice, the artist whose work awakens something nameless, the friend whose silence heals more than words. They are culture's conscience even when culture does not know it. And yet to walk this path is to feel the wound of invisibility. To be a bearer of truth in a world that fears truth is to carry rejection in one's bones. Here, Jung's concept of the shadow becomes vital. The shadow is everything we deny, repress, or refuse to see within ourselves. Spiritually intelligent women often live in tension with the collective shadow because they cannot help but perceive what others suppress. Their very presence calls forth projection. People accuse them of being judgmental, aloof, or strange, when in reality they are simply mirroring back truths that others cannot yet face. But their task is not to fight these projections, nor to take them personally. Their task is to integrate their own shadow to ensure that their discernment is not contaminated by arrogance, that their solitude is not poisoned by bitterness, that their service is not corrupted by ego. Jung warned that those who encounter archetypal forces must tread carefully for the danger of inflation. The belief that one is more important than others is always near. The spiritually intelligent woman must therefore cultivate humility as fiercely as she cultivates wisdom. To know she is a vessel, not the source, a channel, not the creator. Here we glimpse the essence of their invisible strength. They live as thresholds. Thresholds between the conscious and the unconscious, between the personal and the collective, between the visible and the invisible. And like all thresholds, they are liminal spaces, uncomfortable, undefined, often misunderstood. But in this liminality lies their power. They remind us that reality itself is layered, that the seen world is only half the story, that the psyche is vast and mysterious. Their influence cannot be measured, yet it is real. They may never know the full impact of their presence, the ripples that spread from a word spoken at the right time, from a silence that allowed another to break open, from a synchronicity that set someone on a new path. Their legacy may remain invisible, written not in books or monuments, but in hearts, in the quiet transformations of those they touch. And this is perhaps the most profound truth of all their lives, are prayers in motion. Not prayers recited, but prayers embodied. By walking their path with authenticity, they call forth possibilities that others did not know existed. They become reminders that healing is possible, that meaning can be found even in chaos, that love can be stronger than fear. They are evidence that the human spirit can survive fragmentation and emerge whole. To see them clearly is to see the collective need they serve. In an age of noise, they teach silence. In an age of performance, they embody presence. In an age of speed, they move with depth. In an age of cynicism, they dare to trust the whispers of the unconscious. Their existence challenges the very fabric of modernity, not through rebellion, but through authenticity. And that, in the end, is the quiet revolution they enact. The presence of such women calls us to reconsider what intelligence really means. For centuries, intelligence has been bound to the measurable numbers on an exam logic, in an argument the ability to manipulate data or conquer abstractions. But what of the intelligence that senses, rather than calculates, that perceives hidden truths, rather than solves surface problems? What of the intelligence that belongs not to the head, but to the heart, not to the rational ego, but to the depths of the soul? Carl Jung insisted that feeling, when developed to its highest expression, was not weakness, but wisdom. In the typology of his psychology, feeling is a function equal to thinking, intuition, and sensation. Yet unlike raw emotion, true feeling is evaluative. It knows the worth of things, the weight of values, the authenticity of what is present. Spiritually intelligent women carry this function as a master instrument tuned finely enough to hear the subtlest vibrations of truth. This is why their presence unsettles and inspires in equal measure. They cannot help but recognize the falseness that others work so hard to maintain. But we must recognize how radical this is within our cultural context. We live in an age dominated by the archetype of the hero, the conqueror, the doer, the rational achiever. To embody an archetype of feeling, receptivity, and intuition is to swim against the current of civilization itself. This is why so many spiritually intelligent women feel alien, because they are carrying the archetype that culture represses. They are, in Jungian terms, the carriers of the collective shadow. And so the paradox, what is marginalized in society, is precisely what society most needs. The wisdom of the feminine, not in the sense of gender roles, but in the symbolic sense of receptivity. Intuition, nurturing, and depth is the missing balance in a world that idolizes domination, speed, and productivity. Spiritually intelligent women hold that balance not as ideology, but as embodied truth. By living it, they remind us that to be whole, humanity must integrate the feminine just as each individual must integrate their shadow. This integration is not easy. Jung taught that individuation requires the confrontation of the unconscious, the descent into what is unknown, unwanted, feared. These women undertake this descent continually. Their solitude allows them to face the voices within that others drown out with distraction. Their suffering forces them to confront wounds that others bury in denial. Their sensitivity exposes them to truths most cannot tolerate, and yet they persist because they know that only by embracing the darkness can the light be genuine. Think of the myths where the hero descends into the underworld: Orpheus, Persephone, Inanna. These stories are not just old tales. They are mirrors of the psyche. And the spiritually intelligent woman walks this myth daily. She dies little deaths in her solitude, faces demons in her pain, wrestles with gods in her dreams. Each descent strips her, humbles her, and yet also transforms her. Each return brings new wisdom, new wholeness, new strength. And this is why her presence carries such weight. She has lived the descent and survived. She has seen the underworld and returned bearing gifts. She has held paradox in her hands, light and shadow, joy and grief, love and loss, and integrated them into her being. When she sits with you, you are not only in the presence of a woman, you are in the presence of myth itself embodied. Her very existence testifies to the possibility of transformation. But we must also remember the danger. Archetypal energies are immense, and to carry them without grounding is to risk collapse. Jung warned of inflation, the danger that one might mistake identification with an archetype for personal greatness. Spiritually intelligent women, especially in their early path, may struggle with this, believing themselves chosen special above others. It is only through humility, often painfully learned, that they discover the truth. The gifts they carry are not theirs, but humanity's. They are stewards, not owners; channels, not creators. Their task is not to exalt themselves, but to serve. And service for them rarely looks like grand gestures. It is often invisible, the listening ear, the presence that heals without words, the small synchronicity that shifts a stranger's life. Their service is subtle, quiet, unmeasurable. They may never be recognized for it, but recognition is not the point. As Jung wrote, individuation is not for the sake of perfection, but for the sake of completeness, for the sake of becoming what the self demands. Their lives fulfill this demand, often at great personal cost, but always with great collective benefit. Here we touch the cultural crisis of our time. The world is flooded with information, but starved for wisdom. We can measure everything, yet understand so little. We pursue endless productivity, but lose touch with meaning. The spiritually intelligent woman stands as a living critique of this imbalance. She does not reject intellect, but insists that intellect alone is not enough. She does not scorn progress, but reminds us that progress without soul leads to ruin. She is in her quiet way the conscience of civilization. And perhaps this is why, though misunderstood, she is also so deeply needed. She reminds us that we are not only minds but souls, not only individuals but parts of a collective, not only bodies moving through time but beings connected to eternity. She teaches us not through lectures but through living, that to be human is to embrace mystery as well as knowledge, silence as well as speech, presence as well as performance. To speak of the spiritually intelligent woman is to speak of the hidden architecture of human evolution. She is not an isolated phenomenon, not merely an exceptional personality, but part of a lineage that stretches back to the beginnings of time. Across cultures and centuries, she appears under different names and guises: the seer, the midwife of souls, the prophetess, the healer, the witch, the wise elder. Sometimes revered, sometimes persecuted, but always essential. She has been burned at the stake and enthroned in temples. She has been silenced in households and honored in myths. And yet, despite the shifting tides of history, she remains because the archetype she embodies is indestructible. It is woven into the collective unconscious itself. When Carl Jung wrote of the self, he described it as the totality of the psyche, the organizing principle that draws us toward wholeness. The spiritually intelligent woman, in her own way, serves as an emissary of the self, not only her own, but the collective self of humanity. Through her sensitivity, solitude, suffering, and silence, she becomes a vessel for truths larger than her personal story. She reminds us through her being that the path of individuation is not optional. It is the demand of the soul. To ignore it is to fragment. To embrace it is to heal. But what does this mean in the world we inhabit now? In a time of disconnection where attention is fractured and meaning often feels like an endangered species, it means that her presence is more vital than ever. For while our culture rewards loudness, she embodies the power of silence. While our systems thrive on performance, she insists on authenticity. While our technologies accelerate, she slows down to listen to dreams and symbols. She is in essence a counterbalance to the frenzy of modernity, a living reminder of what cannot be quantified, digitized, or monetized. And though her life may feel small, it is never insignificant. A conversation with her might alter the trajectory of someone's choices. A word she speaks carefully chosen may echo for years in another's heart. A synchronicity she recognizes might save someone from despair. She may never see the full ripple of her influence, but it exists. Like a stone dropped into water, her being creates rings that move outward, invisibly touching lives she will never know. Herein lies the humility of her path, to accept that her greatest service may always be invisible. She may never be acknowledged, never be celebrated, never be understood in full. And yet she continues because she is faithful not to recognition, but to the deeper current of life moving through her. She has learned that her task is not to shine, but to serve, not to perform, but to embody. And in that embodiment she becomes radiant, not with glamour, but with authenticity. Jung spoke often of the return to simplicity. After the storms of analysis, after the labyrinths of shadow work, the goal is not complexity, but wholeness. A wholeness so complete it appears ordinary. The spiritually intelligent woman, as she matures, embodies this return. She no longer seeks to appear extraordinary. Her wisdom no longer needs performance. She wears her depth lightly as naturally as breathing. To meet her is to encounter not spectacle but presence, an ordinariness suffused with the sacred. And this is the final paradox. The more spiritually intelligent she becomes, the less she appears different from anyone else. The extraordinary dissolves into the ordinary, but at a higher octave. She may be the quiet neighbor, the unnoticed colleague, the friend who does not dominate a room, but transforms it nonetheless. Her impact is subtle, but it is real. And in a world intoxicated by display, this subtlety is a revolutionary act. If you recognize yourself in these words, know this. Your sensitivity is not a flaw, but a faculty. Your solitude is not exile, but initiation. Your suffering is not meaningless, but a crucible for wisdom. Your silence is not emptiness, but presence. The intelligence that flows through you is not imaginary. It is ancestral, archetypal, eternal. You are part of a lineage of women who have walked this path before, and your steps add to the ancient rhythm of their song. Yes, the path is difficult. Yes, it asks for courage beyond measure. Yes, it requires faith in what cannot be proven. But it is also meaningful beyond words, luminous beyond measure, and necessary beyond doubt. The medicine you carry is not for you alone. It belongs to a world aching for authenticity, for depth, for connection to the unseen. So trust the whispers of your intuition. Honor the rhythms of your solitude. Embrace the paradox of your suffering. Walk with humility in your synchronicities. Speak with care, and when needed, remain silent. For you are not just a woman navigating her life. You are a threshold between worlds, a bearer of invisible wisdom, a reminder that humanity is more than machines, more than markets, more than the shallow surface of culture. You are proof that the soul still breathes in this world. And so the journey does not end here. It cannot end, for it is not linear but cyclical, a spiral that deepens with each turn. As you walk, you contribute not only to your own wholeness, but to the healing of the collective. Each act of authenticity, each moment of presence, each silence offered in compassion adds to the invisible tapestry of transformation. You may not see its pattern, but you are part of its weaving. If these words stir something in you, let them not be the end, but the beginning. Reflect on the traits that resonate within you. Share your story, for it may awaken recognition in others. And most importantly, trust that your invisible intelligence is not only real but needed. The world may not always recognize it, but the deeper intelligence of life itself does.